like this?
Sorry? Yes. No, I mean, in a place like this, yes. But obviously I've been to countless other institutions before. Can they hear us?
They could if they chose. Most don't. May I ask how you do it?
Do what?
Make your judgments. How you decide if a man is truly mad or not.
Well, it's a complicated process.
Doesn't seem complicated to me. This lot, all of them, mad as the day is long. Dangerous. Don't see why an assessment is necessary when they're dribbling like babies and howling like wolves.
Well, the mind is a complicated beast, Miss
Green?
Miss Green. They may seem damaged or disturbed, but that does not mean to say they cannot be fixed.
There's no fixing to be done here, I can assure you. You clean them up and send them back out there, they'll only find their way back. You mark my words. Here he is. Ernest Hemmel.
What's he done with the window?
We had to cover it up. At night he'd scream and start tearing at the walls, scratching, scraping. He'd damage himself quite badly. We sedate him and strap him up. Took us a while to figure out it was the light, the moon he was afraid of. We covered it up, he hasn't made a peep since. So we found him like that, pale as a ghost, as if he'd been scared to death. Timid fella to look at him now. But when you hear about what he'd done, well, like they say, the quiet ones.
Tick-tock, 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 tick the clock, as Ernest Hemmel sat quiet and still in the darkened corner of his apartment block.
No light, but a slight dusting from the distant moon. Still he sat,
Calm and patient.
as he watched, rapt from his window.
Eyes straining as they peered across the empty void to reach their goal.
No movement but the occasional twitch from his clammy hand, restless, revealing the inner itch which lay beneath the calm waters in which his body bathed.
Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick past 9 on the clock.
Counting down the remaining moments of this wonderful vision,
Love,
he called it to himself.
devotion, a quiet, admirable devotion which would one day be embraced.
For his eyes were felt. He knew that much. He was but one party in this game, which was shared with another.
She felt him, he knew it.
And every night she would sit for him as he watched her in the darkness.
So still, almost like a painting, the clean whiteness of her skin, the long flow of her hair glowing under the light of the pale moon.
They both played their parts most willingly.
Waiting, each alone but not alone, as the ticking clock counted down the moments of their nightly encounter.
He would sometimes forget to breathe, his eyes drifting across the emptiness to embrace her fully. He held her tightly and dreamt of her touch.
She belonged to him.
Does he ever speak?
Not to me. Just sits there staring at that picture of his.
And who's the woman in the picture?
I believe it's his mother. Some say it's that young girl they found that night, but that's probably just stories. Get a lot of that round here, people talking. It's as if the truth isn't enough for some people.
La la, la la, la 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 la, la la, la la, la 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 la, la la, la la, la 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 la, la la, la la, la 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 la.
Miss Gwendolen Bertram,
A most divine creature.
a most exquisite young maiden.
Glanced around at the hundreds of burnt-out candles that covered her room, each one a different beautiful wax figurine that had become crooked and disfigured as the candle had melted. She glanced down at the figure in her hand,
Sparkling away like her very own special star.
The stars were shy in the city in which she lived, veiled by gas and steam and smoke and cloud, reticent to be seen clearly for fear they may be snatched or snared from their hiding places.
But not the bright moon.
Gwendolen sat, as she did every night, waiting for the moon to pierce the horizon of the foreboding apartment block that sat across from hers, still and menacing, like a heavy hound abandoned by its master.
she felt a finger of moonlight reach down and caress her face. She smiled, blew out her candle, and opened the curtains of her apartment window to let the light embrace her.
She loved the moon.
Its glow was like a balm to her broken eyes, not like the harsh, cruel sun, her captor that kept her locked up inside, too strong for her porcelain skin, too harsh for her gentle, misted eyes, clouded pearls that felt shape, form, and light, but could barely see past the confines of her room.
Unlike the sharp, hawk-like eyes that were trained upon her as she sat, smiling gently.
She was unaware of his invasive gaze, but clutched her tightly in her seat.
She couldn't see into the dark window of the dark building that loomed beyond her sight.
She couldn't see that in that darkness sat a man.
Still, calm, patient, watching.
Looking at her with as much love as she looked upon her moon.
He watched her.
As she watched her moon.
And the clock ticked and tocked.
Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock.
Until the time was up.
Next door sat a young man,
Thomas Thistle!
cursing the shrapnel that peppered the flesh of his thigh and the pain that clutched at his right leg with the stubby fingers of a scared child.
He had spent much of his time alone in the months since his discharge from the army.
Struggling at first to cope with the sprawling randomness of life outside the military, faced with a terrifying, oppressive freedom, and the heaving lack of purpose that hung like an albatross around the neck of one's everyday existence.
He longed for some form of companionship, a distraction.
And seeing the face of the young lady who lived next door had lifted his heart higher than it had been since moving into the building.
He had never seen anything like her.
Her shock of soft white hair cascading like snowdrops from her shoulders. Her skin so white, almost translucent, but sublime in its purity, like a china doll.
And those eyes.
He clutched the small wax figurine he'd spent so much time carving tightly in his hand and stared down at it.
She's so close.
His eyes bored into the walls, as if through sheer will they would be able to pierce them and rest upon her face.
He dreamt of her.
As she watched her moon.
And as she was watched from the dark window of the dark building,
After a moment, he grabbed his stick and
Knock, knock, knock.
Tick-tock,
Tick-tock.
tick-tock, ticked the clock as Gwendolyn Bertram sat quiet and still watching her moon.
Knock, knock, knock.
Gwendolyn's heart leapt when she heard the knocking at the door. She wasn't used to visitors. She called out, "Hello," and was greeted by a warm, rich voice.
Hello.
Wings of butterflies beat in her stomach.
Her hand trembled slightly with excitement as she rose to her feet and opened the door.
And there she found him, the man for whom some reason she hadn't been able to shake from her thoughts.
She smiled.
Hello?
Oh, hello. My name is Thomas Thistle. I'm from next door.
Oh, yes, I remember. My name is Gwendolyn.
Oh, well, I was just, Oh, well, it's silly, really. Well, I wondered if you might want some company.
Tick-tock, 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 tick the clock, as Ernest Hemmel watched Miss Gwendolyn Bertram watch the moon.
Knock, knock, knock! The index finger of his right hand twitched. As her eyes dropped their gaze for a moment, she turned her head a fraction to listen.
She spoke.
Ernest could not hear the words, nor guess what they were. He couldn't even imagine the sounds of them in her mouth as she spoke, having never heard her voice. This fact ached inside him.
His hand clenched as she rose to her feet. He shifted slightly as she headed towards the door.
He looked at the clock.
Tick-tock, tick-tock!
He rose to his feet and placed his hand against the window, his heart pounding like a mother who had lost her child on a crowded street.
His clammy fingers left fingerprints upon the glass as he stared and stared.
Movement. A man.
Hello.
Oh, hello. My name is Thomas Thistle. I'm from next door.
Oh, yes, I remember.
My name is Gwendolyn.
I was just, well, it's silly, really. I wondered if you might want some company. Just wondered if you might.
Ernest forgot to breathe. His heart thundering in his chest, pounding as if trying to escape. Her eyes on him. Her moon was forgotten. She smiled. Ernest had never seen that smile before.
Blood seared through his veins as a familiar rage began to engulf his being.
He pressed his face up against the window, his now boiling breath heaving and wheezing and clouding the glass. His hands now clenched to fists, shaking slightly.
He watched as they spoke words he could not hear, as they exchanged the looks, laughs he would never understand.
Ernest's eyes welled with tears of fury, and he hammered his fist against the window once. As he did so, his mind flicked to the body of his mother sleeping gently nearby.
He didn't want to wake her.
He strained his ears, heard no sounds of stirring, so returned to his watch.
Thomas Thistle bade Gwendolyn Bertram good night.
The moon rose in the sky, and Gwendolyn returned to her darkness.
Thomas returned to his apartment, almost unaware of the pain in his leg that followed him around like a starving dog. He had been silenced by his happiness, pacified by contentment. He moved to his window and turned on his light.
A light appeared in another window.
Ernest saw the face of the man.
The man he had been cursing. The man he didn't know.
A tiny droplet of blood slid down the crease between his left thumb and forefinger as he slowly unclenched his fist
allowing his nails to slide out of the grooves they had created in his palm.
In his right hand, he felt the weight of the knife he had snatched from the kitchen drawer moments before.
Ernest's breath deepened. The man stood there, smiling. Ernest flinched as the man seemed to stare directly at him.
But he knew he could not be seen. Could he?
Thomas stood at his window, a contented smile upon his face, until something caught his eye.
He blinked, momentarily blinded. From a dark window of the dark building that overshadowed his apartment, a light was flickering upon his face.
He strained his eyes trying to detect the source of the light, but every time he thought he could make out the shape of a figure, it struck him again, flashing his eyes out of focus. It fluttered intently around them like a moth around a flame.
A signal. A warning, a cry for help.
Thomas rested on his stick and counted the blocks of the building.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 floors up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 across. On the corner.
Ernest's heart was racing as the man in the building opposite seemed to stare directly at him.
How could he see him? How could he know?
The knife in his right hand trembled as the moon high above shone down upon him, and its light caught the blade.
Thomas stood for another second, staring at the source of the light, then turned and walked out of his room.
He is coming.
Ernest stood in the dark, his breath heavy as his nostrils filled with the pungent scent of the fresh hothouse flowers that sat as they always did in the vase on the table beneath his mother's portrait. He waited.
Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock.
Ernest pushed himself up against his window to get a view of the ground between the two apartment blocks, and he waited.
13 floors below, he saw a dark figure move towards his building. He clutched his knife tightly in his hand and moved to his door.
He is coming.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 floors up.
There was a knock.
Ernest stared at the door as the knocks echoed through his bones. He's here.
Ernest moved to the door and reached for the handle.
Ernest pushed himself up against the wall and opened the door. He listened and tried to remain still. He could hear the heavy breath of the figure on the other side.
1 step. 2 steps.
Footsteps crossed the threshold.
3 steps. 4 steps. 5 steps.
Ernest's heart thundered in his chest. His knuckles whitened around the knife in his hand. Beetles of sweat scuttled across his brow.
6 steps. 7.
Ernest slammed the door shut and launched himself upon the figure, plunging the knife deep into the back, feeling its blade scrape slightly against fragments of spine.
A small, searching glow of moonlight found its way into Ernest's apartment.
Ernest's heart stopped as he caught sight of the shock of white hair that fell into his arms. Gwendolyn went to close her curtains, something caught her eye.
A flash, a sparkle, like a star twinkling just for her.
She gazed out, her failing eyes struggling to find their target.
The star remained, twinkling brightly, shining into her eyes.
Her very own special star.
Its light caressed her face. It was calling to her.
Another gift.
She smiled.
It came from the dark window of the dark building across from hers. Straining her eyes to make out the shapes of the windows, she counted the blocks of the building.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 floors up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 across on the corner.
She remained there in the darkness a moment longer, watching her twinkling star, before turning and walking out into the night. As she crossed the space between the two buildings, she looked up and saw the moon high up in the sky, shining down upon her.
She followed her star.
Whee! All the way.
To the entrance of the building. She started climbing the stairs.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 floors up.
She counted the doors.
1, 2, 3, 4, 7 across on the corner.
She knocked.
Nothing.
She turned to leave, but as she did, she heard the gentle creak of the door opening. Her heart fluttered. She stared inside the dark apartment. She could see nothing but the thick darkness. She stepped forward.
1 step, 2 steps,
Crossing the threshold.
3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps,
She looked around, trying to find her star.
6 steps, 7.
Gwendolyn's eyes opened wide as she felt the knife into her back. Her mouth dropped open as she struggled to breathe.
She could not scream. Her lungs refusing to inflate as they snatched at the stale air of the apartment.
A strange feeling in the pit of his stomach, fueling his curiosity.
Anxiety pricked the hairs on his neck and back.
From behind walls of bric-a-brac, he uncovered a small tin box.
He opened the box, a tobacco tin, some letters, photographs.
His military-issue handgun.
Thomas froze like a child confronted with the ghost of a long-forgotten fear.
The gun had never been fired.
He felt a sharp pain in his right leg. A scream from the shard of shrapnel that was now becoming a piece of him.
Biting away his pain, he pushed the handgun aside and retrieved the old pair of binoculars he sought.
Pulling out his handkerchief, he wiped the years of dust from their lenses before heaving himself to his feet and returning to his apartment.
He walked to his window and counted the blocks of the building.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 floors up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 across on the corner.
His hands clutched the handle of his cane tightly as he raised the binoculars to his eyes and stared into the dark window of the dark building. A small shaft of moonlight crept inside the apartment.
He saw her, pale as a ghost, her long white hair resting gently on her shoulders.
1 step. 2 steps.
She crossed the threshold.
3 steps. 4 steps. 5 steps.
She looked around.
Thomas thought he could make out the shape of a figure behind her.
6 steps. 7.
The flash of the blade caught the moonlight, blinding him.
He dropped the binoculars. His hard legs were the witness. He couldn't reach. With shaking hands, he scrambled around on the floor to retrieve his father's binoculars. 13 up, 7 across. He returned the binoculars to his fearful eyes.
Thomas saw the face of the man staring back at him, eyes cold as stone, full of hate.
With hot blood on his hands. Ernest saw the face of the man. The man who should now be dying in his arms, standing there in the opposing apartment, watching him. He drew his curtains shut.
Mr. Hamill?
Yes?
I'm sorry to bother you at this hour, but we've had reports of a disturbance coming from your apartment.
A disturbance?
That's right. Just need to ask you a few questions.
What questions?
May I come in?
Of course.
Nice place.
Thank you.
Yours?
Yes. Can I get you anything? A drink?
A drink. Yes, maybe a hot drink, thank you. It's not too much trouble.
Tea, perhaps?
Tea will be most efficient.
May take a few moments for the kettle to boil. The water here is always very cold.
Quite.
May I ask what questions?
Well, we have had reports of a disturbance.
What kind of disturbance?
Are these curtains always closed?
Often when it's dark out.
Are you alone?
How do you mean?
Have you had company this evening?
Oh. No.
Reports of a pale young lady.
A pale lady? What happened to her?
What's that smell?
The flowers.
Ah. Fine-looking woman.
Excuse me?
The painting. A pale lady. Your wife.
My mother. She's asleep in the next room.
Oh? I thought you said you were alone.
Oh, I'm alone. She's not well. She sleeps through. You can see if you like. I'd rather not wake her if that's okay with you. She's not well.
Of course.
The kettle! I shall get your tea!
So it was Thomas Thistle who called the police?
I believe so, yes. Said he'd witnessed a murder, that he'd seen a young girl killed. But this was several days before Ernest was brought in.
So what happened?
Well, the officer reported that he found him to be a quiet, polite man. Same as a judge. Normal, calm, helpful. He said the man he brought in several days later could have been a completely different person altogether. Described him as a shell. A cadaver of the man he met that night.
Really? And there was no sign of the girl?
No, not at that time. So Mr. Hemmel was most helpful.
So what happened in those few days that passed?
Who knows?
It just doesn't make any sense. How could a normal, seemingly sane human being have been turned into, well, this, in a matter of mere days?
Guilt. Will always catch up with you in the end. A relentless pursuer, you can run from it, ignore it, bury it. Just keep hunting it down. Never stop until it's dragged you into its blackness.
With the warm blood of his victim still on his hands, Ernest reached up to the wall and slowly and delicately he searched for the right spot.
When he heard the sound of a hollow, his hand stopped.
Calmly and with the utmost precision, he began to peel back the wallpaper.
He then carefully removed the nails from the boards beneath. One by one. Then began prizing back the boards to reveal the musty, dark void that lay between the walls. He looked inside.
Black, empty, dead.
He looked upon his victim, the shocking red blood screaming against the soft whiteness of her skin.
And his heart was thundering and his mind was racing. A momentary flood of emotion tried to engulf him, but he held it back.
He took hold of her.
She was light and limp in his hands as he placed her into the cavity.
He forced her elegant limbs into their claustrophobic resting place.
put up a fight as her body was bent and broken and forced into place.
He looked at her pale face one last time, hands shaking with fear and rage and shame. He kissed her cool lips.
At his touch she stirred. She tried to scream, but her body wouldn't allow it. Her hand reached out, a desperate plea, a last call for clemency.
Ernest's heart ripped through his chest. His eyes wide, he tore her tight fingers from his shirt.
He looked into her eyes and she looked into his, both now fully grasping the horror of the situation.
He heard a terrible sound coming from her throat. A sound unlike any he had ever heard before. Primal, animalistic, a dying spirit inside a broken body. He then began replacing the planks. He heard her nails scratching against the wood like trapped rats. The harsh, blunt cracks as her soft nails snapped and splintered against the wood. The dull sound of the numb stumps of her fingers prising against the board.
It stopped.
Slowly, as if approaching a dangerous creature, Ernest edged closer to the wall and pressed his face up against it to listen. Through the wood, he heard the sound of death, the last drops of steam rising from the kettle's mouth. A gentle gasp, a dying breath, death's rattle.
It had ended.
He wiped the knife and returned it to its straw. He mopped up the blood from his wooden floors. He changed his bloody clothes and washed his hands.
Ernest stared at the blank wall. A long shaft of moonlight, the shape of a casket, crept through the curtains, outlining the place where her body lay.
Slowly, he began to notice a tiny speck appearing in the middle of it.
Minuscule, a pinprick, a small insect.
Ernest stared at the spot, fear swelling in his stomach. Fearfully, he reached out a finger and touched it.
It was wet and hot!
Overcome with fear, Ernest ran to his mother's bedroom. He grabbed the portrait that hung above her bed, and with urgency and panic, he covered the damp spot that had appeared to torment him.
He stepped back.
He clenched his fists to prevent his hands from shaking.
They retained a slight redness, a flush that would never leave them. Ernest stared into the eyes of his mother. The clock ticked.
It was a crisp autumn evening when Thomas Thistle first laid eyes upon Miss Gwendolen Bertram. Before then, he had no idea who inhabited the apartment next door. The only sign of life was the occasional sound through the thin wall and the large white candle that would appear on the doormat at the beginning of each week, like clockwork, before disappearing, never to be seen again.
Gwendolyn lived by candlelight. Her eyes were too sensitive for the harsh glare of day, and so she would spend her existence locked up inside her apartment, with only a single lit candle for her to see her way. These candles would be delivered each week, like clockwork.
The candles fascinated Thomas, and on this particular autumn evening he had become overcome with curiosity and had stationed himself at her door, waiting, staring through the tiny peephole at the large white candle that sat expectantly upon the opposing doormat. He waited patiently.
Gwendolyn shuffled through the darkness of her apartment, as she did every week to fetch her candle. She opened the door. The aggressive light of the hallway attacked her senses, and she groped around on the doormat for her candle.
Thomas saw her for the first time. He had never seen anything like her before. Those eyes. The very next day, Thomas ventured out and purchased a large white candle. He spent days carefully carving it, ever so delicately with the razor-sharp edge of his military-issue pocket knife, into the image of the pale lady. And when the day came, he went to his door, opened it, and peering around cautiously, he reached down and replaced the large white candle with his own, before returning to his peephole to wait.
Gwendolyn went to her door to fetch her candle. She opened her door and clutched around in the brightness for her candle. As she touched it, she stopped for a moment. She gently glided her hands over the moulded wax, feeling the contours Thomas had painstakingly carved.
Thomas watched on eagerly, almost forgetting to breathe. He saw what seemed to be the soft shadow of a smile appear across her lips. Hurriedly, he opened the door.
Through the piercing light, she saw him.
They looked into each other's eyes.
Their hearts stopped.
Clocks didn't tick.
Suddenly, Gwendolyn regained herself and shuffled back into her apartment.
This same ritual continued for months. Every week, another perfectly carved visage of her beauty.
And every week, she would remain on her doorstep a tiny moment longer, as if she were aware of his gaze and was rewarding him for his kindness.
They would long to speak,
To say hello.
but each time they just remained there still, silent.
Watching through their peepholes.
Until one day, Thomas decided to knock on her door. Knock, knock, knock.
Thomas Thistle sat, minutes,
hours, days, nights, staring at the apartment 13 up, 7 across, hoping to catch a glimpse of his life. He begged to go back, to change things, but he remained still, fighting against the pain that engulfed his body, the pain he saw as penitence for his inaction. He saw nothing but her absence.
Ernest Hemmel sat, minutes, hours, days, nights, staring at the portrait of his mother that hung upon his wall. A cenotaph heralding an unmarked tomb. A shadow of crimson seemed to creep out from behind every side of her thick frame. The sounds of scratching pricked in his ears. He forgot to breathe, or move, or eat. He just sat there, staring at the picture, fingernails digging deep into the arms of his chair. Minutes, hours, days, nights.
The days passed, and Thomas stared at Ernest.
And Ernest stared at the picture. And the picture stared back. His eyelids, thick like syrup, began to drip onto his cheeks, smothering into darkness. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock.
Thomas had seen death before, many times. It is the price of going to war.
But death is a strange creature. Sometimes it will let you pass by freely. Others it leaps upon your back, forcing you to carry it with you until you can go no further, before dragging you down into the mud with it.
He remembered shivering in the deserted ruins of a derelict building as an enemy patrol searched for him in the remains of his unit. He remembered the moon shining down on the face of the young private they found in the room next to him. The harsh sounds of the words they shouted at him. Words he didn't recognize, but the meaning of which he understood. He remembered the faltering sound of the boy's voice.
Help! Mercy!
He remembered clutching his military-issue handgun and feeling heavy and alien in his shaking hand. He remembered trying to move, to stand, to act. He remembered the moment it started to snow. A flicker of beauty amidst the horror. He felt the snowflakes falling upon his face. He remembered the sound of a gunshot. Then, silence. His heart crashing against his chest like a drowning man hammering at the surface of a frozen lake.
His mother's eyes stared back at him from the wall.
Memories dug at Ernest's skull like a hatchet. Guilt and fear pierced his spine like poison-filled incisors. He forced some air into his shallow
couldn't raise his eyes to meet hers, though he could feel them upon him.
He saw the shine of her perfect patent leather shoes, the familiar sight of the hem of her dress, her stockings beneath. Heel on hard wood.
Ernest tried to tear the unwanted thoughts from his head, pulling at them one by one like strands of hair. But as he pulled, they just got longer and longer. He closed his eyes and braced himself for an impact.
But it never came. The heels of her shoes clicked on the hard wood floor as she turned and walked away.
No. No. Ernest couldn't help but notice that over the past few days the pigment seemed to be draining from his apartment. The carpet, the wallpaper, all slowly started losing their colour, and now they appeared white. Pure white like virgin snow.
Even the portrait of his mother had started to change. Her face had become paler, as if a terrible fright had caused it to turn pure white, and now you could barely make her out against the stark canvas.
He stared at the painting.
The eyes bore into him.
He couldn't be sure, but it seemed to be moving, almost imperceptibly.
It seemed to breathe!
Ernest's heart faltered as he realized the face he was now staring at was not that of his mother, but of a young woman with a shock of white hair.
The eyes of the poor white woman in the painting started to widen, and her breath began to quicken as she tried desperately to fill her lungs but could not. He ran to the wall, tearing down the painting.
As he did so, he revealed the bright scarlet stain hidden beneath.
He watched the mark bleed across his wall, spreading like a cancer.
He closed his eyes!
A shock of red on white.
Her face! Her skin!
He felt the hot liquid underfoot.
Red blood everywhere.
Consuming the walls and the ceiling and the floors, crawling up them like a swarm of fire
The
ants.
whole room, the whole apartment drowning in blood.
Scratches echoed through him from every wall.
Where is she?
He ran to the kitchen, dragged open the drawer and pulled out his knife.
He could hear her breath, feel it upon his face.
The hothouse flowers attacked his senses.
He couldn't breathe!
He rushed to the window and flung it open.
Ernest felt the icy breeze on his cheek and filled his lungs, gulping at the fresh night air, his shaking hand clutching the knife as the moon's rays shone down upon it. Stirred from an uneasy slumber.
Something was waking him, calling him. Something he felt, a light upon his face. Light, signal, warning, cry for help. The light that he'd seen before, the light from the night that she died. Thomas stared up at the dark window of the dark building. 13 up, 7 across. Something sparked inside his chest, a determination. He heaved himself to his feet, grabbing at the handle of his gun. The gun had never been fired. He lurched out of his apartment and across the space between the two buildings, ignoring the shrieking pain in his leg as metal chewed on flesh and muscle. He opened the doors and began climbing the stairs, hammering his stick down hard upon each step. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 floors up. He counted the doors. 1, 2.
Ernest heard the footsteps sway. He clutched the knife tightly in his palm. She is coming!
Thomas clutched the handle of his gun with a vicious intent, as if trying to choke the life out of it. 7 across, on the corner. Bang, bang, bang!
She is here! Ernest couldn't bear it any longer. In desperation, he started clawing at the walls, scratching at the wallpaper with his fingernails, pulling out the nails, prizing back the boards, trying to find her, to reveal her, to set her free.
Bang, bang, bang!
Ernest stared into the blackness.
Bang, bang, bang!
Ernest forgot to breathe.
Bang, bang, bang! The sound that Thomas heard from the other side of the door would stay with him for the rest of his life. Even amidst the horror of war, he had never heard such a sound emerge from another human being. It filled him with dread and horror and pity.
Unable to battle his morbid curiosity, he slowly forced open the door and raised his gun. The first thing that hit Thomas was the smell.
In the blackness, he saw a large portrait of a pale lady lying abandoned on the floor. Next to it, he began to make out the shape of Ernest Hemmel, lying there, motionless.
Thomas saw a shock of white hair on Ernest's head and an expression on his face that chilled him to the core.
Ernest's hand twitched involuntarily. Thomas saw the flash of the knife. He lowered his gun. It would remain unfired. It's as if he'd seen a ghost. Maybe he had.
And what of the young girl? The one Thomas Thistle had thought he'd seen killed?
The girl was fine. They found her tucked up in his mother's bed, sleeping. A single punch wound near the spine that had been dressed and treated. Apart from that.
And his mother?
Tick.
Slowly the moonlight seeped into Ernest's apartment.
Tock.
Thomas followed the shaft of moonlight as it crept up the wall,
Tick. Tock.
illuminating a spot where the wallpaper had been torn back and the planks removed,
Tock.
revealing the cavity.
Tick. Thomas forgot to breathe. As through the darkness, he saw the decaying body of Ernest's mother. Her hands and face contorted into their final expression of fear and desperation.
The moon's rays rested gently upon her face, at peace.
She'd been there for years, hidden in the walls. Stabbed her in the back, his own mother. They reckon she was still alive for days after he buried her. Neighbours reported scratching in the walls around the time, but they thought it was rats. And when the noise stopped a few days later, they thought no more about it. Poor woman.
tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. Ernest sat in his cell, staring at the picture of his mother that hung upon the wall. He tried to ignore the scarlet stain that crept around the outside of her frame, and the sounds of scratching that pricked in his ears. She belonged to him!